The 1st Maine falters not, but keeps on its course. A shell from a battery on the right comes screaming in with harsh voice along the line, apparently directly over the heads of the men, and seeming so near as to make it impossible, almost, for the left of the regiment to escape its effects, and bursts a quarter of a mile away. This is followed by another, and another, in quick succession. On they go, and see, the rebel force that a moment before has driven the Harris Light now breaks and is in full retreat, and the charge has turned into a chase. Hi, my name is Bill Coughlin, and host of First Person Civil War podcast. While the generals of both sides get most of the recognition, the Civil War was fought by the men in the ranks, and they told their stories during and after the war. Follow me as I reveal what these men witnessed in the battles of the Civil War. Episode 48 is entitled Sergeant Edward P. Tobie and the 1st Maine Cavalry at the Battle of Brandy Station, and relies on his book, History of the 1st Maine Cavalry, 1861 to 1865, which he published in 1887. Edward Parsons Tobie, Jr. was born on 18 March 1838 in Lewiston, Maine. Prior to the war, he worked as a printer at the local newspaper, the Lewiston Journal, and eventually at a book publishing business in Massachusetts. The state of Maine was directed to raise 10 regiments at the outbreak of the Civil War, which it rapidly did. It was not until the second call for troops did the U.S. government authorize the state to raise a regiment of cavalry. On 19 October 1861, in his hometown of Lewiston, Edward Tobie enlisted as a private in Company G in order to report to Augusta, Maine. By early November, the 1st Maine Cavalry completed its organization with a complement of 12 companies. The 1st Maine Cavalry was sent to Virginia, where they saw combat at the First Battle of Winchester and the campaigns of Second Bull Run, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. Following the battle, the Union Army underwent a reorganization, which resulted in the creation of the Cavalry Corps. As the Battle of Chancellorsville raged, now Sergeant Tobie and the 1st Maine Cavalry participated in the raid led by Major General George Stoneman. Following the Confederate Army's success at the Battle of Chancellorsville, General Robert E. Lee decided to invade the North for a second time, with the intent of entering Pennsylvania and destroying the Army of the Potomac in that state. On 3 June 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia began its march and headed west toward the Shenandoah Valley. Once there, the Army would march up what is known as the Great Appalachian Valley into Pennsylvania. The Union Army of the Potomac, after confirming the Confederate Army was on the move, began its march on 5 June. While initially unaware of the Confederate Army's full intentions, the Army of the Potomac would march between the Confederates and Washington, D.C., to ensure the safety of the capital. Critical to the movement of both armies was the use of cavalry, which could perform reconnaissance, to scout the movement of the enemy, and screen, to protect the movement of your own army. Both Union and Confederate armies would employ cavalry in the days and weeks of marching ahead. And on 8 June 1863, Sergeant Tobie and the 1st Maine Cavalry received orders to conduct a reconnaissance of the Confederate Army as it moved toward the Shenandoah. The order to march was received about noon on the 8th, and in short time the regiment, with the division, was in motion and moving toward the river. All that afternoon could be seen immense clouds of dust across the river, indicating that large forces of the enemy's troops were also in motion. and the boys felt there was hot work in store for them. After a dusty, uncomfortable march, the regiment bivouacked on a large tract of land in the vicinity of Kelly's Ford, where the boys were treated to an unusual amount of getting into position, or as they called it, poppycocking, and finally were allowed to lie down to sleep, with a cold bite and holding the horses by the bridles. Sergeant Tobie and the 1st Maine Cavalry rode in the 1st Brigade, commanded by Colonel Judson Kilpatrick, of Brigadier General David McCurtry Gregg's 3rd Division, of the left wing, also commanded by Brigadier General Gregg, in Brigadier General Alfred Pleasanton's Cavalry Corps, of the Army of the Potomac, commanded by Major General Joseph Hooker. For the opening stage of the march north, Major General Jeb Stuart, the Confederate cavalry commander, bivouacked his entire division northeast of the small town called Brandy Station, which was along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad and on the western bank of the Rappahannock River. The reason for such a concentration was for show. Major General Stuart intended to conduct a grand review on 5 June, with General Lee in attendance, but was delayed to a more subdued review for the general on 8 June. With all 5 of his brigades participating, Major General Stuart was unaware that the entire Union Cavalry Corps had discovered his position and was encamped on the eastern bank of the Rappahannock River on the evening of 8 June. At dawn the next morning, the Union Cavalry intended to cross and engage with the unsuspecting Confederates. On the morning of 9 June, 1863, the Union right wing crossed the Rappahannock River at Beverly's Ford and engaged Brigadier General William E. Jones's and Brigadier General William H. F. Lee's brigades. The Battle of Brandy Station had begun. The Union plan of attack called for a double envelopment, with the right wing advancing down from the north, while Sergeant Tobie, the 1st Maine Cavalry, and the entire left wing crossed the river approximately 6 miles to the south and would advance north toward Brandy Station. A brief halt was made when orders were received to tighten the saddle girths and load the carbines, which were rapidly obeyed, and the regiment again started, shortly after emerging from the woods into a large open field. As soon as the regiment debouched from the woods, it formed into squadrons at a gallop, drew saber, and in a moment more was charging across the field. And thus, before the boys were aware of it almost, the regiment was in its first cavalry charge as a regiment. Major General Stuart, now aware of the situation, began to direct his forces on the battlefield. He sent one of his brigades of cavalry down the Kelly's Ford Road to block the Union cavalry who were already making their crossing there. But he was unaware that the left wing had already divided and taken several different routes once across the river. Major General Stuart, upon learning that Union cavalry were advancing on a separate road toward his headquarters, summed up the ground soon to be fought over. On a field geographically so extensive, and much of it wooded, presented to the enemy so many avenues of approach, I deemed it highly injudicious to separate my command into detachments to guard all the approaches, as in such case the enemy could concentrate upon any one, and, overwhelming it, take the others in detail, especially as I was aware that the entire cavalry force of the enemy had crossed the river, with a large portion of artillery, and supported by 9 regiments on the road to Kelly's, and 7 on the road to Beverly's Ford. I conceived it to be my policy to keep my command concentrated, excepting sufficient to watch and delay the enemy as to his real move, and then strike him with my whole force. Major R.F. Beckham, commander of Jeb Stuart's horse artillery, placed several pieces on Pettus Hill, which faced to the south, while the brigades of Brigadier General William E. Jones and Brigadier General Wade Hampton posted to the east of the artillery and readied themselves for the impending fight. It would be Stuart's headquarters and the Confederate artillery that would be the target of Sergeant Tobie, the 1st Maine Cavalry, and the entire Union 3rd Division. At the left, as far as the eye could reach, were to be seen bodies of Union cavalry advancing with quick movements toward the enemy's cavalry, who were also in full sight and apparently as active. A little to the right of the front, near a house surrounded by extensive shrubbery, was a rebel battery which turned its attention to this regiment as it emerged from the woods. Keep this in mind as the narration continues. As the Union 3rd Division and the Confederates charged at each other, Sergeant Tobie and the 1st Maine were witnessing an engagement of approximately 13 regiments of cavalry, all vying for possession of Fleetwood Hill. The whole plain was one vast field of intense, earnest action. It was a scene to be witnessed but once in a lifetime, and one well worth all the risks of battle to witness. But the boys could not stop to enjoy this grand, moving panorama of war. On they went, amid the perfect tangle of sights and sounds, filled with such rare, whole-souled excitement as seldom falls to the lot of man to experience. And thoughts of danger were for the time furthest from the minds. Even the horses seemed to enter into the spirit of the occasion, and strained every nerve to do their full duty in the day's strange deeds, obeying the least motion of rein or spur with unusual promptness, as if feeling the superiority of their riders in this terrible commotion. As the 1st Maine Cavalry bore down upon Fleetwood Hill, it was the 2nd New York Cavalry, also known as the Harris Light Cavalry, and the 10th New York Cavalry that led the brigade. They would have to contend with the 12th Virginia Cavalry and the 35th Virginia Cavalry Battalion, who arrived upon Fleetwood Hill just prior to Kilpatrick's brigade. Major General Stuart commends these men in forcing the New Yorkers to retreat and regroup. Sergeant Tobie and the 1st Maine Cavalry, to the New Yorkers' immediate right, met the Virginians on the top of the hill. The 1st Maine falters not, but keeps on its course. A shell from a battery on the right comes screaming in with harsh voice along the line, apparently directly over the heads of the men, and seeming so near as to make it impossible, almost, for the left of the regiment to escape its effects, and bursts a quarter of a mile away. This is followed by another, and another, in quick succession. On they go, and see, the rebel force that a moment before has driven the Harris Light now breaks and is in full retreat, and the charge has turned into a chase. Major General Stuart, still directing his cavalry from a vantage point to the north of Fleetwood Hill, witnessed the clash of Union and Confederate cavalry. The contest for the hill was prolonged and spirited. Harmon's regiment, the 12th Virginia Cavalry, attacked the enemy, driving back his advance, but broke in confusion at the approach of the enemy's reserves, and in doing so, deranged very much White's column, which was advancing to his support, and lessened materially the force of White's charge. As the Union cavalry gained an upper hand on Fleetwood Hill, the artillery on Pettus Hill soon became the focal point of several Union charges, which included Sergeant Tobie and the 1st Maine Cavalry. On goes the regiment, driving the enemy from the battery, and passing by the lonely and now quiet guns that a moment before were so loudly talking. On they go, faster and faster, if that were possible, over fences and ditches, driving the enemy a mile or so. Oh, it was grand! And many a man who was in that charge has at times fancied that if he were allowed to choose, he would say, "Let me bid this world goodbye," amid the supreme excitement of a grand, exultant, successful cavalry charge like this. Colonel Kilpatrick, brigade commander of the 1st Maine, expounded on the charge. I sent orders to these two officers to withdraw and rally their commands, and with the 1st Maine, swept to the right and charged the enemy in flank. They outnumbered us 3-1, but could not withstand the heavy saber blows of the sturdy men of Maine, who rode through them and over them, gained the hill, captured a battle flag, which was the 12th Virginia Cavalry, and many prisoners, among them rebel General Stuart's adjutant general. From this moment, the fight was a series of charges, every regiment of the brigade charging, rallying, and again charging, until ordered to retire. Each regiment left the field with its organization preserved and in good order. The Union cavalry, both left and right wings, departed Brandy Station after several hours of fighting. Among the casualties sustained that day was Sergeant Tobie, who was captured at some point in the fighting. Though he did not share the exact manner of which he got captured, Sergeant Tobie did highlight the importance of the regiment as a fighting unit during charges and countercharges. Never was the fact more clearly demonstrated that in a battle it is the safest, as well as the best, for each individual to stick to his command than it was here, for those who remained together got off the field with small loss, while those who scattered, many were taken prisoners. The Battle of Brandy Station was the largest predominantly cavalry engagement of the Civil War, and at the end of the day, the Confederates held the field. The Union cavalry were not successful in their attempt of a double envelopment, but they did prove that the new Cavalry Corps could fight against Major General J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry, which was an organized force for almost a year. The Battle of Brandy Station would have unintended consequences for Lee's second invasion of the North. In the wake of the battle, Southern newspapers began to criticize Major General Stuart of the circumstances leading up to Brandy Station, as the Union cavalry were able to get so close without being detected. As both armies marched toward Pennsylvania, J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry provided screening and guarded the route of march. They even met the Union cavalry again at Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville. In the wake of these engagements, Major General Stuart decided to depart from the Army of Northern Virginia. J.E.B. Stuart, wanting to redeem himself after Brandy Station, attempted to disrupt the Union Army's march, but was met with limited success. He took 3 brigades of cavalry and rode between the Union Army and Washington, D.C., which meant Lee did not have adequate cavalry to conduct reconnaissance when his army camped to the north and west of a town called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. With no cavalry to warn of a Union presence in their immediate front, a Confederate division, which included 3rd Lieutenant Rogers of the 47th North Carolina, attempted to march into the town of Gettysburg to acquire shoes on 1 July, 1863. On 26 September 1872, the survivors of the regiment held their first reunion and created the 1st Maine Cavalry Association. The association appointed Edward P. Tobie as historian and was ordered to write a history of the regiment. Though appointed with the task, various members of the association assisted him in completing the history by 1877. To all, to the comrade who prepared the foundation for more than half the company rosters, or sent me the muster-out roll of his company, or the monthly returns of the regiment, or furnished the complete roster of his company, to the comrade who gave me a single story of camp, or field, or prison experience, or the list of casualties in his company in some little skirmish, or his own record, or merely called to mind some almost forgotten incident of the service, to each and all, I can only say thank you, and all the comrades will thank you as I do, though they know not your names. 10 years later, in 1887, Edward P. Tobie published History of the 1st Maine Cavalry, 1861 to 1865, to the general public. Thank you for listening to the 48th episode. Links to Sergeant Tobie's book and social media accounts are now available on the podcast website, firstpersoncivilwarpodcast.com. While there, you will also find a link to support the podcast financially at the top left of the screen. Any amount is welcome and goes toward the expenses of the podcast. On Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn this week, you will find a picture of Sergeant Tobie sometime during the war. Since the Battle of Brandy Station opened the campaign, I have decided to make the next episode a special episode, which will release on 2 July with the climactic battle of the campaign. Captain Frederick Otto Baron von Fritsch of Company A, 68th New York, face Private George Washington Nichols of Company D, 61st Georgia, on 1 July at Barlow's Knoll. And Captain Neil W. Ray of Company D, 6th North Carolina, at Cemetery Hill on 2 July at the Battle of Gettysburg. My name is Bill Coughlin, and thank you for listening to First Person Civil War Podcast.